All right, everybody, welcome back to this lecture. So, this week we are going to be diving into what might be one of the most challenging concepts we're going to explore this semester, okay? But also, I really believe one of the most important for really understanding environmental justice and conflicts as they occur within the environmental space, okay? So, before we jump in, I want you to think about something that, might surprise you, right? When I say Yellowstone Park, right, what is the first thing that comes to mind? It might be pristine wilderness, maybe the Big Geyser, Old Faithful, could be bison herds, stunning landscapes, right? You probably think about America's first national park, a conservation success story that's, been replicated and celebrated across the world. But what if I told you that this success required making people disappear? What if some of our most beloved conservation stories were built on the foundations of systematic injustice, right? And this might not be news for some of you, and this might be, a first time hearing this for others, right? But this cognitive dissonance that you might be feeling right now, that's exactly where we need to start. And that's where I want you to draw from this lecture, right? We're going to explore structural violence, systematic injustice, more in depth, and how conservation practices specifically that we often celebrate can, in many cases, systematically harm some of the world's most vulnerable communities, right? Now, by the end of this lecture, my goal is for you to understand a lot more about that concept I've been throwing around in other lectures, fortress conservation, right? It was a model that was established 150 years ago. And the ripple effects of this continue to create many environmental injustices today. I'm going to really show you how traditional research methods, sometimes they miss these patterns of harm completely. And I'm going to really try to walk you through an understanding of why we need these different approaches that we're going over in this course, right? And this week, we're going to specifically touch on how to conduct interviews, qualitative social science interviews that are coming from a justice lens. And we're going to use structural violence as kind of the case study, okay? So take a moment right now, think about that conservation success story. Take a look at these mountains, right? Maybe you can also think of some other national parks you visited, right? A wildlife refuge, maybe you admire, or a marine protected area, right? We've talked a lot about those. How might that story change or your feelings change if we ask different questions, right? Who maybe paid the price for that conservation success? These are the topics that we're going to talk about today, okay? So my objectives, again, are just kind of walking through these, defining structural violence, distinguishing it from direct violence, tracing these historical examples and case studies to a global practice, helping to, develop skills for you in IDing patterns from the past that can show up and persist within contemporary environmental justice issues, and really unpacking this structural dimension of environmental justice and seeing how we can apply this to research, and then also introducing you to interviews in this lecture, but then the next one is a lot more of a deeper dive, okay? So what is structural violence, right? Understanding this is key. And I want to really kind of unpack this for you, right? So this was developed by Norwegian peace researcher Johan Galtung in the 1969, right? And this definition, it might sound academic at first, and it is, right? But stick with me because there's a practical application here, right? Violence, which is built into the structure and shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances, okay? This is violence, which is built into the structure and shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances, right? Think about that definition. Notice how different this is from what we typically think of as violence, okay? We're used to thinking about direct physical harm between individuals, someone hitting someone else, right? Armed conflict, verbal abuse. But structural violence is harm that emerges from how society is organized, right? It's violence without a villain in the traditional sense. Instead, the violence comes from systems, policies, and institutions that systematically disadvantage certain groups. Okay, let me give you a simple example that might resonate, right? If students from low income families can't afford college, and this limits their life opportunities, that's structural violence in action, right? No one is directly attacking anyone. And some people, do make arguments that violence is too harsh a term, right? But that's the structure of the education system creating harm, right? What else could we call that? In conservation, this might look like, someone saying, we need to protect this forest for future generations, or biodiversity conservation requires tough choices. These statements aren't necessarily false. They're not, evil, horrible statements, right? But they could potentially be hiding whose voices are excluded from those decisions and who's bearing the costs of those tough choices. What makes structural violence particularly insidious, okay, is that it often appears legitimate. It's normalized. It's backed by laws, policies, and institutional procedures, right? People experiencing it are often told, this is for the greater good, right? Or this is just the way things are. We talked about that, right? Here's something I want you to try, okay? Think about an environmental problem. Maybe it's air quality again, access to green space, waste management, deforestation, loss of a species, whatever comes to mind, right? Ask yourself, is this problem experienced equally by everyone, right? I've asked you to do this before. Or maybe are some bearing burdens in different ways? Again, I'm triangulating you around this question quite a bit, right? This is inequality showing its face, right? And you're starting to see this structural violence in action. But to see this really in a critical lens, ask yourself, how is this normalized, right? How is this become just something that I accept? Or maybe others around me have just learned to accept, right? So again, I've asked you that question before. I'm going to ask you again. I really like for us to come back and reflect on these questions. But now, think about that structural component, that structural slow violence. We're going to talk about slow violence as well, right? How is that normalized? Okay? So again, we talked about this direct versus structural violence. Direct violence can be visible, right? It's often committed by an individual. It can be event-based. It's easily recognized in some cases. An example would be armed conflict over resources, right? Structural violence can be invisible. It can be institutional. It can be ongoing. It can be normalized. This could be policies that exclude communities from resource access, okay? I hope this makes that maybe a little bit clearer. So let's go back to Yellowstone and this idea of creating wilderness, okay? We're going to trace how structural violence really became embedded in, I'm going to put myself in the moon, in global conservation through one pivotal moment, right? It was the creation of this national park in 1872. Now, when Congress designated Yellowstone as the world's first national park, the official narrative was beautiful and democratic, right? They were protecting pristine wilderness for the benefits and enjoyment of the people. But here's what that language concealed, right? The Crow, Blackfeet, Nez Perce, and Shoshone indigenous peoples weren't considered the people whose benefit mattered, right? These communities, they were already managing the land systems, right, for centuries. These were their seasonal hunting grounds and spiritual connections to these places that stretched back thousands of years. Creating this park required redefining these lands as wilderness, a place where humans don't belong. This wasn't a natural category, but a social construction that served a very specific political and economic interests, okay? It was used to justify removing indigenous peoples while opening these areas to white tourists, researchers, and eventually extractive industries in surrounding areas. And here's the crucial part, right? This model became the global template for conservation. Colonial administrations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they looked to Yellowstone as proof that effective conservation required removing people from nature. They adapted the legal mechanisms, the scientific justifications, and the moral arguments. This is how a model developed. In one specific context, became a global template for what we call fortress conservation. This is conservation that treats human presence as incompatible, okay, with natural protection. What made this structural violence rather than simple colonialism was how it became so deeply institutionalized through legal frameworks, scientific expertise, and moral narratives about conservation. It's not just bad policy. It is the creation of an entire system that still functions today in many, many ways. So I just want to jump back here again to look at the Yellowstone case. So again, this empty land narrative is what I want you to continue to think about and focus on, right? This justified displacement, right? I really want you to keep that in mind. Remember how we talked about this epistemological, violence and injustice, and also this when we were going through discourse analysis? Yeah, think about some of that and connect that back as well. Now, this sort of export of fortress conservation, right? It followed a very similar trend across the globe, kind of a pattern, right? It often involved colonial administration, scientific conservation, right? Like whose expertise, whose opinions mattered, and then some form of legal displacement of the indigenous community, and then ongoing exclusion and blockade of that community from accessing this region, right? So the Yellowstone model spread across 3 different continents under different colonial administrations, right? And I mentioned, right, this pattern. In South Africa, for instance, Kruger National Park, this displaced African communities in 1898, and then later became integrated into apartheid policies that prevented Black South Africans from accessing their own lands, right? The conservation goal provided scientific and moral justification for racial exclusion. In Tanzania, the Serengeti case is particularly striking because the Maasai had coexisted with wildlife for centuries. Under this fortress conservation, their traditional grazing practices were actually supporting the ecosystem, right? There's traditional ecological knowledge and hard scientific data that shows this. But the conservationists didn't agree. The Western science defined their presence as a threat, and this led to their eviction and the criminalization of their traditional practices. We're going to go into a case study later on in this talk about what the Maasai are still facing in Kenya today. In India, Jim Corbett National Park followed the same pattern, right? Forest-dwelling communities who had sustainable relationships with tigers and other wildlife were redefined as threats to conservation. Their intimate knowledge of wildlife behavior and forest ecology was just dismissed as unscientific. This is a sequence, right? I talked about it, but colonial administration is providing the political power. Western science, then, is providing this technical justification. The legal systems provide an institutional mechanism, and conservation ideology produces the moral framework. Each step appears legitimate within its own logic, okay? But the structure of the system consistently produces the same outcome. Local communities lose access to lands and resources they depend on, while distant actors gain control and benefit over those conservation decisions. Let that sink in, right? This is textbook structural violence, right? No single actor intended this outcome. Each institution followed legitimate procedures, but the structure systematically prioritized certain values and interests over others, right? And the scale of this displacement is hard to quantify, right? There are so many hidden costs. And I want you to understand that we're not just talking about historical injustices. This is not just things of the past. This is happening right now. And the scale is staggering, okay? Research by Charles Geisler and Raquel de Souza estimate that 20 million conservation refugees worldwide exist today. 20 million people. That's more than the population of New York State, okay? Think about what these numbers actually represent. Each person in that 20 million figure has a story. Families separated from ancestral lands, traditional livelihoods. Folks have been criminalized for, from collecting medicinal plants and, caring for their livestock, right? It's all been disruptive. In the Central African Republic, over 100,000 Baka people have been affected by WWF conservation areas. This example shows, their traditional hunting and gathering practices, sustainable for centuries, are now criminalized, right? In India now, tiger conservation often involves relocating entire forest communities, despite evidence that these communities often have lower negative impacts on the tigers themselves than tourism or industrial development, right? And this is what I really want you to understand, that this is set to expand dramatically, okay? The goal of 30 by 30, this international conservation goal that aims to protect 30% of Earth's area by 2030, this could make things a lot worse. We're currently at 18%. That means that bringing an additional 12% of global land surface under conservation management, people are living in these spaces. It's occupied by indigenous and rural communities, right? If we do not acknowledge and address this structural violence, this expansion could create the largest displacement of communities in human history. And we're not even talking about climate change, climate refugees, any of that. This is just for conservation, a measure that is targeted to try and limit the impacts of climate change, right? This is why understanding these patterns, it's not just an academic exercise, right? It is really about understanding the human consequences of environmental decision making, right? Environmental success stories often are celebrated, but their impacts are not fully investigated. And unfortunately, some of those that bear the most harm have very little voice and ability to speak out. And this morphs into what Rob Nixon terms slow violence, okay? This concept, coming from Dr. Rob Nixon, a literary scholar, it helps us understand why structural violence in the environmental space is so hard to see and document, okay? Nixon recognized that our focus on dramatic, visible environmental disasters often causes us to miss the gradual forms of violence that affect the world's poorest and most vulnerable communities, right? He calls this slow violence. Let's think about environmental problems that typically get a lot of media attention. Oil spills like the Deepwater Horizon, a nuclear accident like Fukushima, right? Dramatic species extinctions. These are what Nixon calls in terms spectacular violence. They happen quickly, they have clear causes and effects, and they generate public outrage, okay? But slow violence operates differently. It unfolds over decades or generations. It's very hard to document, to photograph and film, create narratives around. It affects communities that already have limited political power, as I mentioned, and it's often disguised, unfortunately, as something beneficial, like conservation, right? In conservation context, slow violence might look like this, right? A coastal community gradually, over time, loses access to traditional fishing areas as marine protected areas expand, right? Each individual restriction, it seems reasonable, right? We're protecting spawning grounds for a specific, species. We're working to limit overfishing, right? We're looking to maintain biodiversity, right? But over time, the cumulative effect is that a fishing community can no longer sustain itself through traditional means, right? There's no dramatic moment of displacement. There's no visible villain. There's no single policy to protest. There's a slow erosion of livelihood, culture, and community autonomy. Children, they grow up knowing less about traditional practices because those practices have been criminalized or made impossible, right? This is particularly insidious because it's hard to research, it's hard to document, and it's hard to keep people's attention in this attention economy, okay? Traditional research methods, they focus on measuring changes over short periods of time, right? It's the most feasible, right? The grant period is this long. My PhD is this long. I have this long to produce the project, right? But the slow violence, it unfolds over large scales, and it's going to exceed what most research projects and funding cycles miss. This is a wicked problem, right? So let's talk about a case study, right? I told you I'd bring you back to the Maasai, right? This is a different Maasai community that live in the Serengeti, right? And they've been experiencing slow violence for a very long time. That is now, again, escalating and rearing its ugly head. And now, this is getting some media coverage, right? But the slow violence that they've been experiencing is often missed in that, right? So the ongoing displacement of Maasai communities across the Maasai Mara and areas of Africa, which they've inhabited for thousands of years, a millennia, right? This perfectly illustrates how structural violence evolves and adapts over decades, right? Before colonialism, right? Before colonial occupation, Maasai pastoralism actually supported wildlife abundance, right? But then, all of a sudden, conservationists wanted to protect this, right? The seasonal grazing patterns created habitat mosaics that benefited different species. These are the seasonal grazing patterns from their cattle, right? During dry seasons, Maasai moved cattle to different areas, allowing vegetation to recover. This was not accidental. It was ecological management that was developed over centuries. It was local ecological knowledge, indigenous local ecological knowledge, right? Where Serengeti National Park was established in 1951, the Maasai were displaced, right? This is direct violence. The Maasai were forced out at gunpoint. But what followed was decades of slow violence that's harder to document but equally harmful, right? The Ngorongoro Conservation Area was created in 1959 as a supposed compromise, right? The Maasai could continue living there, but under increasingly restrictive conditions. Over the decades, these restrictions have gradually expanded. First, certain areas were off limits during certain seasons. Then, traditional burning practices were banned, right? Then, grazing areas were progressively reduced, right? Slow violence is progressing. Each individual restriction was justified in conservation terms, right? But the cumulative effect has been a slow strangulation of this traditional livelihood. Young Maasai increasingly migrate to cities because traditional pastoralism is impossible. Traditional leadership structures are constantly undermined because park authorities make the real decisions about land use, right? There is a definite tokenist participatory injustice going on in many of these meetings I've read about, right? And meanwhile, tourism revenue that, folks come to see Maasai culture, it's flowing primarily to external tour operators in many cases, hotels and international conservation organizations, right? The Maasai have noted that they feel they have become performers of their own culture rather than practitioners of it. It's awful. I mean, what makes this structural violence is that no single actor intended this outcome, right? The park managers, the government officials, tourism operators, and conservation organizations, they all followed legitimate procedures within their own institutional logic. But the structure of the system consistently prioritized certain values and interests over others. And today, right now, we see the Maasai fighting again, this time against rich interests from the Gulf states, from Dubai, from Ritz-Carlton, who are now seeking to build and have begun building this massive hotel right within the Masai Mara to observe wildebeest during the Great Migration crossing the river, violating indigenous rights, violating indigenous beliefs, rerouting these wildlife trails. It's awful. Look that up and look up these stories if you want more information on that. It's all over the media right now. And this brings us to another manifestation of this structural violence within the environmental space. And this is a response, right, to meet contemporary challenges. Rosaline Duffy calls this green militarization, okay? Now, Duffy's research shows, and much more research is coming out, I'll have some links to some recent studies in your readings for this week, that a lot of military approaches to conservation are creating new forms of systematic exclusion and harm. So when conservation becomes a war against poaching, it creates a framework, it creates a norm where extreme measures appear justified. The language matters here. Wars require enemies, and in conservation contexts, those enemies are often the same communities that fortress conservation and conservation efforts have already marginalized. This is not a metaphor, right? In many African countries, anti-poaching units receive training from military contractors. They use equipment designed for warfare, and they operate under rules of engagement that would be illegal in civilian contexts. Shoot-to-kill policies for suspected poachers are increasingly common and increasingly seen as supported across social media, across armchair activists. It creates situations where people can be killed for actions that in other contexts might be minor crimes or even traditional rights. The structural violence dimension emerges because these militarized approaches systematically exclude communities from conservation decision-making while treating them as potential threats. Traditional hunting practices that might be sustainable in all reality are criminalized because they can't be easily distinguished from commercial poaching. Local knowledge about wildlife behavior and ecosystem management is dismissed because it doesn't fit security-focused approaches. This is creating a cycle. Militarized conservation increases community resentment, which justifies more military approaches, which increases resentment. Communities that might otherwise support conservation goals become alienated from conservation institutions, right? What makes this again, particularly insidious, is that it often receives international support and funding. Donor organizations and international NGOs, they support militarized conservation because it appears to produce measurable results, right? It's reducing poaching incidents. It's increased wildlife numbers in protected areas. But these measures are not capturing the human costs, the human rights violations, in many cases the murders, the disappearances, the sexual assault, or the long-term sustainability of approaches that depend on these local communities, right? It's very difficult. And I'm not here making a case to justify poaching, right? But unfortunately, many times poachers come from the very communities that live among these wildlife, right? It's deeply complex. And there's no easy solution. But I want to paint this narrative of how this slow structural violence can account in many cases. Are all poachers victims? Absolutely not. International crime syndicates? Absolutely not. But next time you see somebody say, that poacher should be killed, think about the word choice there and the approach. So linking again this structural violence to our environmental justice framework and the pathways that we've discussed, right? You have to connect. You have concrete tools for analyzing these patterns, right? We've gone over this. Environmental justice is going to give you those dimensions for understanding why this structural violence is violating human rights and fundamental, ethics and equity, right? We don't need to walk through all of these again, but I want to introduce a new dimension, right? So I want to stick to the 5, and I'm going to kind of constantly going back to the 5, but I think capabilities is really important as well to bring into the conversation and to keep in our repertoire, keep in our vocabulary, keep in our toolbook, right? Capabilities justice, this asks whether people can achieve their full human potential. Displacement and criminalization of traditional practices, this doesn't just affect material well-being, right? It's not only affecting distributive, procedural, and recognitional justice. It might be undermining people's entire lives, cultural reproduction, intergenerational knowledge transfer, community self-determination, right? Understanding these connections will help us see that addressing structural violence in environmental, studies, environmental work, conservation, urban settings, it's not just about being nicer to local communities. It's about fundamentally rethinking these approaches to align with justice principles and the kind of lives and the goals and achievements that people in these communities want and seek, right? This directly connects to when you're thinking about how you're going to conduct research and what kind of questions you're going to ask within your data collection, but also in the what kind of programs you're going to be developing, right? So capabilities comes from many different thinkers, but primarily Nussbaum and Sen, and I just want to read this definition out loud. Capabilities justice asks whether people can achieve their full human potential. Displacement, criminalization of traditional practices, they don't just affect material well-being, they undermine cultural reproduction, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and community self-determination, right? They're blocking people from living the good life, right? I wanted to just repeat that and really make sure that kind of hammers home to you. So if I talk about capabilities in the future, I'm talking about the capabilities approach to justice, right? So in contemporary relevance, right, as we talked about, 30 by 30 is a concern that keeps me up at night, right? And we need to think about this and the way we're designing and expanding our conservation environmental goals, right? Half Earth is even more scary for me to think about local communities and the impacts they will face. Nature-based solutions, conservation for climate mitigation, if not planned correctly, as we mentioned with REDD+, these can all cause harms, right? Carbon offsets, as we mentioned, can restrict traditional land use. Payment for ecosystem services can really capitalize, commodify, and lock folks out of, accessing the resources and the environments they live within, right? Private conservation areas are going to completely block access, right? And then, again, as we mentioned, science-based targets often exclude local knowledge and do it in a systematic, institutionalized, justified way, right? Expansion of protected areas without addressing structural violence, not good, right? Market-based mechanisms that treat nature as a commodity, climate urgency used to justify rapid conservation expansion. We need to get the full picture, right? And non-justice or non-critical or environmental justice focused research methods, they often have several blind spots when it comes to structural violence, right? They operate on timelines, as we mentioned, of 1 to 3 years. A survey of current conditions, you might miss that those conditions are a result of gradual processes of exclusion, marginalization that took generations, right? You need to get deep, rich data. You need to hear from people in the community, get those stories, right? Studies that only are going to focus on measurable costs and benefits, they are not going to be able to capture, in many cases, cultural losses, right? The erosion of traditional knowledge or the long-term psychological effects of displacement, right? And then pure biodiversity or ecology or biology focused measures looking at, only ecological outcomes, but treating humans' presence as external to ecological systems, right? We're really missing a key variable that to keep these ecosystems healthy and safe, we need the support of local communities, right? So I just want to kind of frame that for you. We're going to go deeper into interviews, and I'm going to explain, a little bit more about research methods that are specifically designed to document structural violence and use interviews as a method to illustrate this. But I really want to have you think about some questions when we go into the interview discussion next that you could be asking, right? What are the lived experiences of conservation policies, right? How do communities understand changes in their relationship with land and resources? What forms of knowledge and practice are being lost or transformed, right? These questions can really reveal patterns of structural violence that other methods can miss, right? And I'm not here to poke holes in all different environmental movements, right? But we need to ask critical questions, right? Protection for whom and from whom, right? If these, ambitious goals and programs follow fortress conservation model, they are going to create displacement and continued harm that we have seen throughout history and that, we have not yet grappled with fully. And they're going to create new mechanisms for exclusion. And we have to be really vigilant, and we have to be very careful, and we have to ask the hard questions. We have to slow down. So I want to leave you with that. Again, I mentioned, this can be hard, but I hope that, you feel more confident and these approaches are giving you the tools you need to unpack this, to identify it, and to be able to critique it and be a part of the change in this space that is so deeply needed. So I appreciate your attention, and I'll see you in the next talk.